So my book, Ethno-Erotic Economies, looks at what happens when people that have long been marginalized and vilified, but also celebrated for their cultural and ethnic, but also sexual difference, actually have to take that difference to the market in order to make a life, to make a living and imagine a certain future. More specifically, it looks at what happens since the 1980s when Samburu men from northern Kenya have begun migrating seasonally to the coast, to the Indian Ocean, in order to sell souvenirs, dance for tourists, and more importantly, find European women as long-term partners, whether for marriages or intimate relationships. And it examines what happens when the money produced through those forms of sexual erotic exchange then flow into the northern province and the northern district of Samburu, transforming relations of gender, generation, kinship, but also ritual and value. So some of the examples that I'm looking at in East Africa of how the commodification of ethnic sexuality then transforms belonging involve things such as gender, generation, kinship, and so on. So for example, young men who've been traveling to these tourist resorts in order to develop intimate relationships with tourists come to be marked out in their communities as a different kind of men. In the Kenyan case, they're called Mombasa Morans. They wear different kinds of clothes, listen to different kind of music, but they're also part of people's gossip and satirical songs and pop culture in ways that basically then transform how they imagine themselves as men. But in addition to that, the money that these men bring also create all kinds of contestation. Can you take money from sexual relations and invest it in marriages, invest it in money for in food for your children or your parents, or is that tantamount to incest, for example? And what kind of like conundrums, moral conundrums that opens up? And my argument is that everybody participates in these debates, whether or not they actually are involved in the sexual economies. And in that participation, what is being reimagined is what it means to belong, what it means to be an ethnic subject in the post-colonial context, what it means to be a moral, ethical person in that particular context as well. So issues such as ritual, marriage ceremonies, bride wealth, age grade relations, which for people interested in East Africa are very familiar, probably very familiar with, that people are initiated in age grades. All those come to be transformed in relation to this money flowing into the northern parts of Kenya. The way I came to be interested in things such as plastic and its association, for example, with growing homophobic sentiment, which is kind of an odd association. You would hear people on social media and in opinion columns in newspapers say that, in Kenya that is, that homosexuality is a polluting plastic from the West that basically doesn't fit with the chemistry of African bodies, and I'm quoting here. And I find these kinds of associations very fruitful for thinking. These are odd associations, but very, very powerful ones. And what they basically reveal is that the conditions for the reproduction of homophobic sentiment are not necessarily lying in rights and law, or the absence of rights and law for sexual minorities, which much of activism is focused around, but oftentimes in objects and materials that people worry about, panic about, displace affects onto, but that have almost nothing to do with sexuality per se, or nothing that we would immediately recognize as being about sexuality. So in the book that I'm currently working on, I'm interested in what I call these queer objects, whether it is plastic, whether it is debates about adults ending up in diapers because of certain kind of practices, including sexuality, but also witchcraft and so on, and many more objects. But the takeaway point, and this is where I think the Global South broadly construed figures in centrally, is that thinking from the Global South with these kinds of queer objects has a lot to give us in terms of denaturalizing or decentering sexuality as a somehow fixed domain that somehow might have all the answers within it. So what would it mean to look beyond something that we think of as sexuality? What would it mean to look at objects that might have nothing to do with it, yet are very much about the reproduction of homophobic sentiment?